The Skink, the rather unassuming second tier on the ladder hierarchy of the Seraphon forces, is an unassuming creature, small, typically no larger than the average dwarf, and certainly not nearly as muscular or well built, but gifted with an unusual intellect far beyond that of the average mortal, almost as though a piece of the Slann is within them, you could say. Welcome back to Void War Studios, and we are going to be talking about the Skink Star Priests, as, below their Slann masters, who basically have complete control over their underlings in terms of intellect, the Skinks actually are really the second tier on this ladder. As whilst, in terms of military matters, it tends to be a Saurus warrior, the Skinks tend to deal with, well, everything else. This ranges from magic, scouting, instructing the various creatures under their command to build the various temple cities, maintaining them, deciphering what the Slann are trying to tell them to do, unearthing texts, finding lost artifacts, all kinds of things which, really, without a intellectual middleman, would make the Slann kinda useless. If you removed the Skinks from the Slann's sphere of influence, then all they have left are the Saurus warriors, which, whilst not stupid per se, are very limited in what they are capable of independently. The Seraphon would in fact not be able to function at all. The Skinks don't seem to desire any particular praise or gifts or rewards. It is enough for a Skink to simply be noticed by a Slann. If a Slann pays a particular attention to a Skink, that will frankly be enough for the Skink to die happy. Quite frankly, the Skinks have the intellect where they can worship through choice, but they would make no other choice because, well, they're kind of programmed to worship these Slann Starmasters and ensure that no harm comes to them. It's all kind of a product of the Slann's will back in the old world, where they needed servants to, well, go out and do slightly more complicated things, which the Saurus warriors would find a bit more difficult. And it is this intellect and independence that they have that makes them such an invaluable tool. Whilst Slann do not like anything outside of their control, they have more than enough control over the Skinks to ensure that everything they do will always be for their best interest. Even if the Skink priests may struggle to interpret what the Slann actually wanted them to do. Let's just say, for example, that during a cosmic dream of some kind, a Slann manages to uncover a relic, maybe a lost piece of technology from the old ones, for example, and finds out its location. He may convey to a Skink priest, essentially, that there is a lost artifact here, and they want it. Slann aren't particularly big on the details, especially when talking to their Skink priests, as they have a habit of confusing them far too easily, and therefore try and give them instructions that are relatively straightforward. Artifact here, please retrieve. And then leave it up to the Skinks and the Saurus warriors to, well, go and do the heavy lifting, per se. Skinks actually make excellent diplomats, and there are many Skink priests who have diplomatic relationships with various cities of Sigmar, as well as the realm of Azurheim, and the Stormcast Eternals in general. The Skink priests, whilst their language tends to be this strange combination of chirping and clicking, they are capable of forming words and conversing with other races in their own tongues. And it is these Skink priests who tend to be the diplomats who will go and speak with various other leaders. And in an ideal world, the Skink priest, having been told by a Slann Starmaster to please allow them to, well, go under their city and unearth said relic and bring it back to the Seraphon starship, or temple city, whichever we're talking about at this point. And, in an ideal world, the Skink priest will understand that starting a war is not necessarily what the Slann wanted, they just want to have the artifact. And if there is a way to achieve this without shedding violence, and doing it in the most ordered way possible, then that is probably what the Slann would probably want. However, there are plenty of Skink priests, or Starseers, who decide that perhaps a more direct route is required. As their Slann master said, go retrieve artifact, bring it to me. And they might decide that the easiest, quickest way to do this is to steamroll the unfortunate city built on top of the artifact, murdering everyone inside, and then digging up the artifact and coming home, covered in blood and gore, and hoping for a pat on the head from their Slann daddy. Is it any wonder why the Seraphon are considered a mysterious race of beings who sometimes attack faces for no real reason that the forces of order, destruction or chaos can understand? I'd like to think that 9 times out of 10 this is probably because a skink misinterpreted what the Slann actually wanted them to do. The Slann might have said to a particular skink, please go here and retrieve something, or go do something, or go achieve something. And in the process of doing so, the skink, in their intellectual wisdom, decided that this was the best way to do it, and unfortunately, yeah. Sometimes things go a bit pear-shaped when middle management doesn't entirely understand the complexities of what you're trying to ask. But then again, when it comes to Slann and skink, the Slann does often feel that it's trying to communicate to something that, well, I suppose it's a bit like a human trying to communicate with a cat. You can, sort of, train cats. You can communicate with them, and you can convince them, believe it or not, to do things. But the cat's got its own mind, and even though it wants to please you, some of the time, it's gonna go off and do what it thinks it's best. And that's not necessarily going to be the thing you want. And the Slann just kind of have to sigh and deal with the consequences 9 times out of 10. But I have mentioned priests. Skink priests tend to be divided into 2 differing classes. There are the Star Priests, who are the highest ranking echelons of the Seraphon order, with the top skink typically known as a Star Seer. These are the skinks that tend to be closest to their Slann. It is they who will communicate with it on a regular basis, decipher what it needs, decipher what it wants, and communicate its wants and desires to the Saurus warriors who will go off and do the thing that the skink tells them to do. Skinks basically talk to their subordinates, in this case the Saurus warriors, with essentially the authority from a Slann. These skink priests kind of allow the Slann to check in, as it were. So when a Slann has been in some deep meditation for goodness knows how long, and comes back out of it, the skink priests are there to essentially make sure that the Slann understands what the day is, when it last ate, what's going on in the mortal realms, the kind of important things that, when you can kind of remember back potentially millions of years, and your mind can literally wander thousands of miles, it can be a bit tricky to try and work out what's actually going on in the present time around you. Therefore it is the skink Starseer's jobs to try to guide their Slann and keep it from getting too lost in the past or the future. It is skinks that create the various weapons and armour that are used for the differing Saurus warriors. It is the skinks that maintain the palanquins which allow the Slann to float, and, on rare occasions, they may even be gifted one as well. And their magics are very similar to the Slann, calling upon the destructive powers of Azir to basically blast their foes with beams of searing light. And on occasion, a Slann can use them essentially as a little projector by pouring some of their power into the skink Starseer and then using it essentially as a point-and-click device, destroying whatever is in the way that the Slann decides shouldn't be there. Now in terms of power, and in the game, Starseers are the wonderful skinks that float around on the palanquins on the tabletop. With a wonderful 5 wounds, 5-inch move, 5+ save, and a 6-up bravery, they have a relatively okay stat. The 5-up save isn't going to save you from very much, but you are only a skink after all, and a skink with 5 wounds is surprisingly impressive. As you're on a palanquin, you can of course fly. You have the Cosmic Herald ability, meaning that your skink is really, really good at manipulating the outcome of the battle through seeing into the future and the past, basically. Allowing you, on a 4+, at the start of your hero phase, to get an extra command point, which, particularly in this new edition, is very, very valuable. And with your Astromancer's staff, At the start of a charge phase, you can pick a friendly Seraphon unit within 12 inches, and if you do so, you can attempt to charge with that unit if it is within 18 inches of an enemy instead of the 12. And normally this would be a problem because you only have a 2d6 charge. Well, with this particular ability, thanks to the Astromancer's staff being able to alter the flow of time, you roll 3d6 when you charge. So yeah, you grant your Seraphon units an extra d6 for the charge range, meaning that you have a maximum potential of 18 inches, which is pretty fan-frickin-tastic, and it means you'll be able to get into close combat far faster, which is, quite frankly, where the Seraphon excel. And of course, you are a wizard, and you can cast and unbind one spell a turn. And your special spell is known as Control Fate. This to represent the ability that the Starseer has to essentially see into the future and read these skeins of fate, usually in the benefit for their master, at least intentionally. Control Fate has a casting value of 7, and if successful, you pick a unit within 18 inches, so long as it is visible to you. If the unit's an enemy unit, until the next hero phase, you subtract 1 from their saving throws, for all attacks that go onto that target. If it's friendly, you add 1 instead. So this gives you a nice little play, because you can basically control your enemy's saves or your own. So if you're being charged, or if you know you're going to be charged, you can increase your saves, making it all the harder for your Saurus warriors to break. If you decide you really want to remove that unit of Chaos Knights, you can lower their save and give your Saurus warriors a better chance of chopping through them. Very, very nice, very, very handy. And whilst the 5-up save isn't going to save you from very much, at the end of the day, if he's in the front lines, you're doing it wrong. That's all I'm going to say. But he does have a decent missile weapon, 18 inches Astral Bolt, representing the Astromancer's staff firing Azir light at the enemy, 2 attacks that hit and wound on 3s, -1 rend and d3 damage, and in melee the staff is also not half bad, with a 2-inch range, meaning you might be able to bonk the occasional Chaos Warrior on the head, 2 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 3s, -1 rend and d3 damage. So again, not terrible, but certainly not someone you want anywhere near combat if you have the choice. Then of course you have the Star Priest on foot. Still with a lovely 5 wounds, 8-inch move, 6 bravery and a 5-up save, the Star Priest is surprisingly tough considering that the Seer is the dude in charge. As an Astral Herald is one of their abilities, on a 5-up you receive a command point in your hero phase. Yeah, Skinks are really handy at giving you extra command points, which means you can do a ton of extra stuff. Like I said, this new edition is really going to show how useful command points are. The Serpent Staff means that you pick a friendly Seraphon unit so long as it's wholly within 12 inches of you. If you do so, until the next hero phase, if you wound an enemy on a 6, the attack, instead of a normal wound, it inflicts a mortal one instead. So yeah, your unit suddenly has attacks that can cause mortal wounds on 6s. And if you have a nice big blob of, say, I don't know, Skinks or Sauruses, suddenly those blowpipes become really damn dangerous, don't they? Which we will get to in a moment, considering you can have a ridiculous number of them. And for magic, your unique spell is Blazing Starlight. Cast on a 6+, you pick an enemy unit within 18 inches, and until the next hero phase, it subtracts 1s from its hit rolls. So yeah, have your Star Priest buddying along with his Star Seer boss, and yeah, screw over your enemy's saves, as well as screwing over with their ability to hit you. And yeah, then give your own unit extra command points, and well, you know, the ability to inflict mortal wounds, because why not? That's hilarious. Its melee attack is again much better than its melee one, being 2 attacks that are 18 inches that hit and wound on 3s, -1 rend and 1 damage, and the close combat attack is okay-ish. 2 hitting on 4s, wounding on 3s, -1 rend and a single point of damage, but I think I get the general gist here that really these priests should not be getting into close combat. That is definitely not what they should be doing. If you're not casting spells and debuffing your enemies with them, again, you're doing it wrong. Don't get into close combat if you can possibly help it. and keep your skink priests safe. There was one final variation on the skink priesthood that we haven't really discussed. Mostly because it's an oddball, really, for skinks at least. Known as skink oracles, these are interesting. A skink oracle isn't quite the same as a star seer or as a star priest, because their preference is purely that they are gifted with a measure of the Slan Starmaster's foresight, meaning that they are able to perceive their presence at all times, and able to feel their presence regardless of how far away they are from their temple cities or from their Slan Master. This bond between a Slan and a skink oracle is so strong that it means that the Slan can see the world through the skink's eyes whenever it decides to focus on them, and it allows them to use them essentially as advanced scouts. Not that the Slan can't necessarily do this with other skinks, it's just that the oracles have such a connection with the Slan that it makes this process far, far easier, and means that it's a hell of a lot more straightforward. And these oracles have an unusual bond with the Troglodons, blind dinosaur creatures that perceive the world through their sense of hearing and smell, and having one hell of a toxic loogie. Skink oracles are born with a strange split tail. This is what marks them out from their other priestly kin, and many scholars assume or hypothesize that it is this split tail that allows these skink oracles to even get close to Troglodons, as their nickname is quite literally the Pale Death, as their toxic spittle is so dangerous that it can melt people on the spot just by touching it, and is so corrosive that it doesn't matter what armour you're wearing, you're gonna melt inside of it, and it's gonna be really unpleasant. Skink oracles only ever go to war on top of these Troglodons, as they provide them with a great deal of protection, and yeah, it's also pretty cool being able to ride around on a giant dinosaur, let's be quite frank here. Floating palanquins made from ancient Old One technology is cool and all, but what about a dinosaur? With 12 wounds, a movement of 10 inches when not wounded, 6 bravery and a 4-up save, it's a fairly respectable stat line for a big beastie. And it's got the whole damage table thing where the more damage it takes, the less it's able to do. But when unwounded, its Noxious Spittle has an 18-inch range, does D3 damage, and hits and wounds on 3s for a flat 2 damage a shot. Its Venomous Jaws are able to wound on a 2+, and they hit on 4s with 3 attacks. Its 2 claw attacks also hit on 4s and 3s, but do 2 damage. And the lovely Divining Rod that the Skink Oracle wields on top, whilst also only being 2 attacks that hit and wound on 4s, does have a -1 rend and D3 damage. But of course, whilst a Troglodon is a pretty awesome little monster, it's not just the monster you take it for. You take it for the lovely, lovely abilities. Because of course, you've now got a magic user on top of a giant dinosaur-shaped bullseye, so you're going to need some decent abilities to keep him safe. Luckily, Troglodons are really damn good at healing themselves, and have a fantastic regeneration ability. Every hero phase, you roll a dice, and on a 2+, you get D3 wounds back. So that's pretty damn good. And if any wounds are inflicted by the Noxious Spittle, until the end of that turn, you can re-roll charge rolls for this model when you're trying to charge it into a unit that you've already spat at, making it highly hilarious if you do fail a charge and it's relatively straightforward to re-roll and then plow on in. Oracle of the Slan means that as it draws on the power for their Slan Master, regardless of how far away they are, they add 1 to their casting, dispelling and unbinding rolls. And on top of that, this model can attempt to unbind spells that are cast anywhere on the battlefield. Yes, that is to represent that the Slan Master is seeing through the Skink Oracle, and basically it boosts their abilities dramatically. The Terror ability that a Troglodon gives off, because, well, yeah, you subtract 1 from bravery characteristics of enemy units whilst they're within 3 inches of this thing. The Venomous Spittle has one extra fun fact. Any unmodified wound rolls from the spittle or venomous jaws that wounded on a 6 inflict an additional mortal wound on top of the damage it was already doing. And finally, we have the magic. Of course, the Oracle is a wizard and can bind and unbind spells, but its unique one is known as Comet's Core. Basically, yeah, this is how the whole portion of a Slaan's magic comes into play, as the Slaan literally channels his power through the Oracle and allows him to bring clusters of comets out of the sky and, well, send them crashing down on anything unfortunate in the way. Cast on a 7, which is really cheap when you think about it, you pick D3 enemy units, and they can be anywhere on the battlefield regardless of line of sight. Each one of those units takes D3 mortal wounds, which you roll separately, and if you cast on a 10 or higher, it's D6 instead. So yeah, that's pretty damn awesome, and well worth taking the Skink Oracle just for that alone. So that is the Skink Priesthood of the Seraphon. An interesting middle management that tries to do its best for their Slaan Master, and, you know, there's nothing wrong with a bit of enthusiasm in your job. That's just how I'm going to leave it. Anyway, I want to thank you all for watching this little channel. 230 subscribers, that is bananas, particularly considering everything that's been going on with GW and all that. But I'll make a separate video about that later. Anyway, I wouldn't be too worried. Everyone should be enjoying whatever content they want out there, and at the end of the day, it's free advertisement. GW can't complain about that. Well, or apparently they can. But anyway, doesn't matter. We're going to enjoy it anyway. I hope you all have a fantastic day wherever you are, and until next time, take care everyone.